everybody. I'm Jennifer, and I actually did not set out to become a translator. I kind of fell into it by accident because I desperately wanted to direct Cyrano de Bergerac. It's one of my favorite stories. I've loved it since my childhood. And when I finished, I had directed a play. I had directed Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare, and at the end of it, kind of things went wrong in the group, and it was kind of a negative experience, really, and it kind of generated a feeling of rejection, and that rejection really made me identify very strongly with the way that Cyrano feels rejected by the world around him because of his, unique nose and his intellect and things like that. And I just thought, this is the next play that I want to do. Well, of course, when you're dealing with a play that has been translated, of course you have to deal with picking the right translation, and then often you have to deal with licensing that translation. And those were things that I had never done before and were very intimidating to me. I'm going to pay somebody money for this play that I really want to do, but it's going to be several years down the line. And so what happened was I started looking at many of the available translations that were in the public domain. And the major ones that are common and appreciated are like the Brian Hooker, which was, I think it was done in the 1920s. And it has moments of pure wonder and beauty in it, but the language is a little dated now. And it's very grammatically dense with the way he does constructions, trying to kind of capture the brevity of the French. He uses very strange English grammatical constructions. And then, of course, the other one is the Anthony Burgess, which I believe you still have to license if you want to do it. And it is a work of genius. He actually follows, so Edmond Rostand wrote Cyrano de Bergerac in Alexandrine rhyme, which is it's a line of 12 syllables, which often has a caesura after the 6th syllable little pause, and it's in an iambic pentameter similar to Shakespeare's. It's in an iambic rhythm, not a pentameter, similar to Shakespeare, but it's actually got 12 syllables in it. So when Burgess did his translation, he actually used that rhyme scheme, and he actually used the rhyming couplets that were exactly like Rostand wrote in the French, so that every other line rhymes. And it's gorgeous, but when you read his translation, you realize he's just added entire scenes into this play that are not in the French. And so, I had read the French when I'm a student of French and I'm francophile, but I'm not fluent. So I had taken a trip to France, working with Texas State, actually. It was one of their go over for 3 weeks and do an intensive course. And I bought the book while I was over there in French and read it. And then as I was reading it, I was like, wait, this scene just isn't in there. Oh wait, all these things that are in here, they're not in here. And that happened with all of the translations that I read, and it was just astonishing to me that it was so different from the original. And so I just thought, well, I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to take one scene, and I'm going to translate that scene, and I'm going to see which of these translations that I have access to is closer. And then one scene became 2 scenes. And 2 scenes became 2 scenes. And it became, this kind of obsessive thing where every night I would sit down with my glass of wine and my computer and I would translate that. And that went on for about 6 months before I had a first draft. And I never really realized I was going to go all the way through. I was just having fun. The first draft was very much a literal translation. It was in prose. And so then I have a friend who's a professor of languages at Wellesley College up north, and so I sent it to him, and I said, okay, so I'm to a point where I'm stuck. Can you give me some feedback on this? And his response was, well, if you want to do this as a prose translation, which is very valid, you have a problem in that it was written with all these rhymes in it, and these words come down directly from the French, and you use them, so you have all these odd little rhymes in your prose translation. And so you either need to remove those rhymes, or you need to do something else that's not prose, because you're always going to have this strange limping rhythm if you try to do the prose with those rhymes in it. And so I was like, well, should I do it in verse? And he's like, well, that would be one option. I think because he was trying not to get me into a bigger project that I could handle. And so it was amazing because, you know, I took my very literal translation and I started writing it, and I used Shakespearean verse, which is kind of the normal rhythm of the English language, you know, which is the iambic pentameter. And I started flowing into that, and it was like this river of words just came out of me, and it was so easy. Like the fifth act, which is the shortest act of Cyrano, it went from prose to verse in an evening. And it just wanted to live, it wanted to be there. And so then suddenly I had, you know, a translation that was in verse, and then after about 2 years of working with my friend Joe Stevenson, who is a professor of Shakespeare at Abilene Christian University, and has become one of the board members of the theater company that we formed to put on this production, which is called the Archive Theater. He basically helped me refine the verse, so it was not bad, and you know, helped me complete this. And then we got it to the point where we're like, okay, now we're going to do it. Now we're actually going to put a theatrical production together, and that's what's playing right now. And so I just wanted to give you kind of a little sample of it. So let me set this up for you. So what I'm giving you today is called the duel in verse. And it's this moment in the first act of Cyrano de Bergerac where the story of Cyrano is that he's basically desperately in love with his cousin, Roxanne, but he fears his own appearance so much that he cannot talk to her about how he feels. And so he ends up working through this handsome young man who is not very smart and can't talk very well to women as kind of his interpreter, and they end up wooing Roxanne together. In the very first act, there is another noble who is desperately in love with Roxanne, but he's already married. His name is the Comte de Guiche, and he's trying to get Roxanne to marry the Vicomte de Malvern, who's accommodating, shall we say. And so in this first act, what happens is Cyrano is trying to get rid of this man that Roxanne is being forced to be married to. And so the Vicomte ends up insulting his nose. And so after he trounces the Vicomte verbally, he then trounces the Vicomte in this duel. And while he does it, he improvises a ballade. So he's, you know, reciting poetry improvisationally while he is completely and utterly beating this man to the death, right? So I'm going to read the French, and then I'm going to read my translation, and forgive me if the French is not perfect. I am learning. So it's so the ballade is actually it's a shorter form of poetry. So Rostand actually has several different poetic forms within his big structure of Cyrano. And this form was very common in poetry of the 14th and 15th century in France. And these ballades were often very solemn and formal and had elaborate symbolism and classical references. And they, as Cyrano says mockingly to the Vicomte, ballade is composed of 3 stanzas of 8 lines and a refrain of 4. So that's what you're going to hear. And Cyrano says, je jette avec grâce mon feutre, je fais lentement l'abandon du grand manteau qui m'effeutre, et je tire mon espadon. Élégant comme Céladon, agir comme Scaramouche, je vous préviens chez mes midons, qu'à la fin de la voix, je touche. And then they had their first engagement of swords. Vous auriez bien de rester neutre, vous vais-je vous larder ding-dong, dans les flancs, sur votre maître, au cœur, sur votre bleu cordon, des coquilles ding-dong, ma peau voltige en bouche, décidément, c'est au bédon qu'à la fin de la voix je touche. Il me manque un rime en autre, vous rampez plus blanc qu'amidon, c'est pour me fournir de mon clôtre, tac, je parle le pointon, vous espériez me faire don, j'ouvre la ligne, je la bouche, tiens bien ta broche l'aridon, à la fin de la voix je touche. He announces solemnly, Pronce. Demande à Dieu pardon. Je cours tes pieds jusqu'à la bouche. Je coupe, je fente. Et là-dedans, à la fin de la voix, je touche. And the way that I translated this is, my hat into the air takes wing. I strip my cloak and so prepare, all carelessly aside tossing. From leather sheath my sword I bear, my revealed elegance is spare, ferocious, agile, fighting fit. So, fawning flatterer, beware, for when the refrain ends, I hit. And they have their first exchange of blows. Now, where should I begin cutting to carve and serve this peacock fair? What shall we have? A leg? A wing? Your pretty ribbons I will tear, and pluck the feathers from your hair. Like buzzing fly, my point does flit. Where will it land? Why, anywhere, for when the refrain ends, I hit. I choose my rhymes with every swing, fit word to blow with utmost care. You're hoping for an opening, but will not take me unaware. I parry and evade the snare. I bind your blade and twist a bit. Look to your sword, it's in midair, for when the refrain ends, I hit. To highest heaven, make your prayer for mercy. God may answer it, but I, who pay and faint, and there, the refrain's ended, and I hit. So some of the problems that I ran into in this entire translation is that, and in this poem in particular, is that there's a lot of classical allusion, particularly in the first stanza, where he's talking about élégant comme Saladin, and also agile comme Scaramouche. So these are, like, Saladin is a beautiful porcelain, and so he's talking about his elegance being like, you know, these wonderful porcelain vases that were very popular in the 17th century. And then Scaramouche is an Italian commedia figure who is very good with a sword. But for the modern American audience, those things don't translate very well. And he goes on to call the Vicomte en Myrmidon, which is basically, that was a classical, just double check, make sure I'm not telling you incorrectly. It was a classical Greek allusion to these, basically these toadies who would kind of do anything that they were told without really any kind of conscience. And so when I made the translation of that verse, to suit my audience, who I really did not think would have that much background, what I did was I took the adjectives that Rostand used, and I took them directly, and then I tried to take the type of person that he was talking about, rather than the specific person that he was talking about. And so that's how I got, instead of Myrmidon, fawn and flatterer, you know, and that's how I got my revealed elegance is spare. You know, I'm not elegant like poetry, but I am elegant, yes. And for Scaramouche, I took ferocious, agile, fighting fit. I just made that right up to fit my rhymes. Which, you know, sometimes you do a little bit when you're translating, if you're trying to entertain people, which is what I'm doing. And then the other things that I kind of ran into are, so this bout is very specifically structured to be a fight on stage. And so he's actually describing what happens in the fight within the poetry itself. So in the next stanza, he's talking about things like, he talks about où vais-je vous larder, where am I going to cut you? Dans la flanque, you know, on the leg, sur vos mallettres. And then he talks about over your heart, under your big sleeve. And so I was trying to figure out how I could make that work poetically and theatrically. So I had to like pick and choose little bits of it. And so he calls the Vicomte a turkey cock, which is not very common English usage. So I just changed it to peacock because I thought that suited him as well, you know. I simplified kind of like where he was pointing, because at the very end he says, oh, it's the stomach where I'm going to hit you. And I just was like, I cannot possibly find a good English rhyme for stomach. It's not going to happen. I can't even find a synonym that's going to work. So I just kind of slipped around that and said, oh, no, I'm just going to hit you. There's a lot of wonderful, forgive me, I'm going to lose the word. It's where you actually have the sounds within the words that you're using. He uses ding dong, because what he's talking about is the swords have these bells that hit each other, and then he uses the way that the French bells, church bells, ring, and he uses that. So that's a lot of fun, and there's actually quite a bit of that, so I tried to get the feel of that as well. And then it's really nice because at the very end, when he's talking about the refrain, the French is very simple and clear, and I was able to use almost all of it. So it's going, where he says, pense, demande, dis pardon, je compte pied, je scaramouche, je coupe, je fin, et le don, à la fin de la voix, je touche. The nice thing is those fencing terms are still used in modern fencing, and so to the modern ear, they actually sound, people understand them. Yep, okay. That's all right, that's actually perfect. So that's a little taste of, what this production is. And then I had a request earlier, so I actually sing in this production as well. So I'm going to just sing you a little quick bit of the song that ends the play, because it's very short.
And then maybe one or two questions.
Oh, you bet. Yeah. So basically, spoiler alert, at the end Cyrano dies, and it's very beautiful and moving. And then the nuns come out and we sing him to his rest. And so it's Avant, Seigneur, et mon sang, vous êtes mon et je suis votre branche. Recevez, mon amour passage de mon livre tombant de la vie à l'amour. Recevez, mon amour passage de mon livre tombant de la vie à l'amour.
I have comments, and that's all. You are one of us. You fell into the translation. You just fell into it. And you stayed up at night doing it because you enjoyed it so much. So absolutely, you're one of us.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. I love being welcomed by you. It's a wonderful feeling. Anyone else?
So I had asked you earlier how long did the whole process take?
So it was about 2 full years before I was happy with something that I had. And then it's morphed and changed as we have actually gone into the production, because I had to cut almost 5,000 lines out of it, because really this play is almost 4 hours long if you do all of it. And so even though it was like cutting my own flesh, I had to just reduce it. But I think I've done a really good job in that you still get the spirit of the play. You don't really lose any of the big sections. You still have the wonderful ensemble that happens and the beautiful poetry that happens. And so I'm really pleased with the way it's come out as a performance piece. Yes?
As a director, how was the process? Like between being the writer, the part in the play, everything, how have you managed to make a synergy out of everything?
It's interesting because a lot of people have trouble directing their own work, but I think I just don't have enough ego involved in it. Because it's not really about me, it's about telling the story, right? And so when the director and the writer have come into conflict, I pretty much just sacrifice the writer and says, fine, I'll rewrite it, we'll do it differently. So, it hasn't really been that hard for me, because enjoy putting it together and not, been stressed about it being perfect.
Have you published it, or
I want to publish it. The process is now, I have to take this reduced, edited version and then go back to the original, the full-scale version, and put all those edits back in, and then of course re-edit all the stuff that we didn't use. So basically, we're either gonna. I have a couple of people who came to see the show that we're talking about that have a publishing company. But if not, then I have a friend who self-publishes her own novels, and she's going to help me through that process of self-publishing.
Or would you consider publishing both, like the extended version and then the theatrical version?
I would do that. I mean, the nice thing is, like, when you can write your own cut, you can do really subtle things to make it flow really smoothly, which is nice. And so I think that would be very useful to directors. But it's one of those things where every director wants to make their own cut, So that would be the question: is do they really want mine, or do they want to make their own? So.
Yes. How long is the play? This play?
So the cut version is 150 pages, and the original version was probably over 200. So. I call it my 300-page love letter to this character.
I hate that you have to go.
I'm so
have to go.
sorry. Yes, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for having me.